Is it the whole year?
Alright, Bismillah, Alhamdulillah, salatu wassalamu ala Rasulillahi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. Rabbi shrah li sadri wa yassir li amri wa hlul uqdatan min lisani yafqahu qawli. We in the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we ask Allah to send His blessings upon our final messenger, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. Inshallah, we're going to continue through with our study of Muslim history, or a survey of Muslim civilizations. And last week we finished up the Crusades. The effects of the Crusades, how the Muslims responded to the Crusades, and really the changing landscape of the middle region of what we would call the quote-unquote Middle East. Today we're going to be taking a detour, let's just say. Not as if the Crusades had nothing to do with Muslims in Spain, in Italy, and Sicily, that's going to get there. But like I had mentioned maybe 5 weeks ago, that when the Umayyads fell and the Abbasids started, there was one member of the family of the Umayyads, known as Abdul Rahman al-Shaheen, or the Falcon, that's the nickname he's given because he flew off, who starts his own rulership in first North Africa and then eventually into Muslim Spain. So that's what we're going to focus on and go all the way down to, we're going to be covering from literally 750 to 1609 of Muslim Spain. Why? Because it doesn't fit into the rest of Muslim history all that well. But you have almost everything you need to know of the major things that would have affected it. The Abbasid revolution took place already, and then the Crusades that will eventually lead to the expulsion of Muslims in Spain has taken place, that we've studied elsewhere. So that's why it's a good time to kind of interject it. Technically, could we have also talked about the Mamluks coming to the rise after the Crusaders, the Mongol invasions, that's coming next. But what I'm going to do for the next 2 weeks, inshallah, is this week we're going to talk about Muslims in Spain, next week we're going to talk about Muslims in India, and then we'll go back into the Muslims in the middle region of the world, which will be when the Mongols invade, and then the rise of the Mamluks after that. Make sense? In the broader timeline, kind of where we are? Okay. So with that said, I'm going to do things a little bit differently. There's an ayah of the Quran, which I want us to all think about. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, talking about Dawood alayhi salam, so they defeated them by the permission of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, بِإِذْنِ اللَّهِ وَقَتَلَ دَاوُودُ جَالُوتَ. This ayah is oftentimes used as an ayah to teach you Arabic, because if you mess up the case endings, you will really get that thing wrong. So anyway, it's a whole other thing. But what I want to focus on is actually what happens at the very end of this ayah. وَآتَاهُ اللَّهُ الْمُلْكُ وَالْحِكْمَةَ. And Allah gave him kingship and prophethood and taught him from which He willed. He teaches him مِمَّا يَشَاءُ. But this next part, and if it were not for Allah checking some people by the means of other, وَلَوْلَا دَفْعُ اللَّهَ النَّاسَ بَعْضُهُمْ بِبَعْضٍ لَفَسِدَتِ الْأَرْضُ وَلَكِنَّ اللَّهُ ذُو فَضْلٍ عَلَى الْعَالَمِينَ. If it were not for Allah checking some people by the means of others, the earth would have been a corrupted space, but Allah is full of bounty to the worlds. We're about to see a lot of replacements, and we've already seen a lot of replacements. Of Allah checking one people by another, you could actually make the argument that what we've seen so far is the Byzantine and Persian empires were constantly fighting each other. So what did Allah do? Replace them. Muslims are going to replace groups of people who are fighting in Spain, but then once they start fighting amongst each other, they're going to be replaced as well. It's kind of interesting to see that there. We're going to see actually someone weaponize this verse in the next 2 weeks from now when we talk about the Mongols. Actually 2 weeks will be Thanksgiving, but when we come back from Thanksgiving we'll talk about Mongols. And Genghis Khan actually very famously went up to Samarkand, and he gave a khutbah where Jummah khutbah would have been done. He was not a Muslim, but he said, I am God's curse on you. He says, I am Allah's curse on you for not following what you were supposed to. Interesting, isn't it? But people are replaced by others. This is one of the sunnahs of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that people get replaced. And we're going to see that play out again and again in our outline of Muslim Spain. Briefly speaking, there are 7 major periods of it. There's going to be the conquest of Spain and civil wars. That is like the briefest period of also in terms of time. But it'll be a very small time in which you have how is Spain conquered, and I'll talk about that for a little bit. Then the Umayyad dynasty is the longest time. It ends up taking, technically it's not the longest in terms of years, but it's one of the most significant. It'll be both an emirate and a khilafah. I'll talk about why that transitioned into it. And then you'll have muluk al-tawa'if, or reis de taifas, in which you will see Muslims becoming very Spaniardized. Doesn't that Reyes de Taifas? Doesn't even sound like. But it'll be Islam becomes very Spanish, and Spanish culture becomes very Muslim. So that'll be then. Then you will have different groups of people coming from North Africa to rule over Spain with the Almoravids first. And once the Almoravids kind of settle in, then you have the Almohads or Al-Muwahidun that take in after that. And then you're going to see the Nasirids and the fall of Granada, where you have a bunch of Muslim rulers who are fighting amongst each other, and they get picked apart one by one by the unification of the Christians that took place after the Crusades. And then Moriscos and the Great Expulsion. Why it's called Moriscos is these are Muslims in name only. You know how there's like in Republicans, they call them rhinos, like rhinos, Republican in name only. These would be minos, Muslims in name only. That they will have a bunch of like Muslim names, but effectively they are just puppets of different Christian rulers that eventually leads to Ferdinand and Catherine, Isabella and Ferdinand, who come and completely wipe out Muslims from the Iberian Peninsula. So it's a pretty sad history, but also don't be fooled by this. While this is happening, you are also going to see among the biggest golden ages that Islam has ever seen, that most Muslims, when you ask them, tell me about Muslim history, they will tell you something about the seerah of the Prophet ﷺ, something about the first 4 Khalifas, and then say there was a Muslim golden age in Spain. But if you ask them the question, why do Muslims no longer exist in Spain, they'll have no idea why. We're going to try to understand that today. Make sense? That's my goal, to get through this much history. So as you can imagine, we're not going to focus on names a whole lot. But the first period is the conquest, approximately 710 to 755. You can technically say this went until 761, but like, just it's a general region, like 800 years of history in one time. But the conquests go from, if you want to see kind of from North Africa, from Morocco, over the Strait of Gibraltar in 710 to 711. There's a very interesting speech that was given when this is being conquered. It's one of the most famous speeches in Islamic history, in which you have the Muslims who crossed over the strait because they're like, whoa, there's a bunch of barbarians on the other side, because it's true, there are a bunch of barbarians on the other side. And what he does is I'm forgetting his name, Qais it's always someone that starts with a Qa. Qais al-Umayya, I believe, he goes across, and as the Muslims are looking at this giant army before them, he actually orders them, everyone look front, and he leads them in salah, everyone keep looking front, no one turn around, and then he burns their boats. And says that if you were chasing something of this dunya, know that your boats have burned. But if you're chasing something of the akhirah, Jannah is in front of you, let's go. So an interesting just strategy of how he goes through, but he actually very quickly is able to. I want you to look at the years over here. So 710, they make contact into Spain. By 711, they already conquered the majority of Spain itself. Why? You're like, oh no, they didn't get the whole thing. That's mountains. No one lives in mountains. There's no cities there. But within a year, they conquer majority of the Iberian Peninsula. And they start going all the way up into France in the next 20, 30 years. So it's actually pretty amazing. Tariq bin Ziyad, and his general, his name is Qais. But anyway, that's that epic speech. What ends up happening after him is he gets killed by his general. That's who Qais is, Musayb ibn Nusayr. And then they take Toledo in 711, take Sevilla 713, the most western parts of Spain all the way up to the north. And why was it so easy for them to do so? Because the people who were ruling Spain right now hadn't been ruling for very long. It had just been taken over by the Visigoth ruler, Rodriguez. His title in history is Rodriguez the Usurper. Why do you think he's called that? Because he just took over. So the Muslims are not actually fighting locals for their land. Who are they fighting? This army that came and invaded, and locals are like, we don't like them either. So that's one of the reasons they conquer very, very quickly. Who was Visigoth? A barbarian Germanic people that had invaded Germany, that had invaded from Germany into Spain. So anyway, they go through pretty quickly. They cross the mountains that divide Spain and France up until about 732. And then they get really far into France, and they manage to go completely east and take over the entire Iberian Peninsula in these small pockets by 751. In that period when this is happening, remember I said Musayyib or Qais, he takes over the Tariq bin Ziyad. So there's a civil war that occurs, and this civil war is kind of interesting, because what ends up happening is the Syrian Arabs are fighting with the northern African converts. So you have the Arabs and the Berbers who are actually fighting. And then the major faction of the Berbers are actually these Yemenis who are siding or have Shi'i beliefs, even though Shi'ism as a whole has not really been collected just yet. Because that occurs, remember, right in the 800s or so. So they're fighting with each other, and that's where the civil war comes from. But the uniting figure from them we'll get into him in a little bit, Abdurrahman, the Umayyad Khalifa, who actually flees from the mainstay of the massacre that took place when the Umayyad revolution, or the Abbasid revolutions kicked out the Umayyads. A couple of things to realize about this conquest. Why did Spain fall so easily? Visigoths were not part of mainstream Christianity, they were seen as heretics. So the local Spaniards actually did not like their rulers, and in many cases they actually fought with the Muslims to kick them out. Next, they had dispelled a ton of Jewish communities that were on the outskirts in these small places in Spain, and the Jews fight with the Muslims in order to kick out the Visigoths and the Christian rulers that existed there. So that's another reason why you have Jewish communities that partnered up with the Muslims in order to do this. And then the barbarian force were already invading, we already talked about that, and they didn't really have central power as a result of it. Questions on why they quickly were able to conquer the Iberian Peninsula? Yes?
If you go to the previous slide, I'm just wondering why, see where it says 713? Like,
Yeah.
why was that taking, like, what, 3 years after they took
So,
up north?
yeah.
Is that also on the other side of the mountains?
No, this isn't on the other side of the mountains. It's there. That's where they had kind of retreated to. So these are the more populous places in Spain, and this will be like a tiny area. So think about it this way: the Visigoths came from here. So if the Muslims are defeating the Visigoths, because that's how you have the local populations on your side, they go up first. This is an authentic Spanish place, so they come to it later. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So you kind of attack the low-hanging fruit first. That's why they move up and take out the Visigoths first. And then they can deal with the others. Yeah. Yes?
What countries constitute the Iberian Peninsula?
Spain, Portugal, I think that's about it. From today anyway. Back then there used to be a couple more different, like, smaller ethnic groups, but today it'd be Spain and Portugal.
Okay. And I had a question about the Civil War.
Yeah.
This is a civil war
Among the Muslims.
The Muslims. Why were they fighting with each other?
Because you had those who were coming from Damascus, there was a idea that the Arabs were superior. That's Asabiyya, straight up tribalism. And they would treat the Berbers, and there was a bit of racism associated with too, because you have the Arabs versus the black convert Muslims, or the North Africans. Is this going to continue happening today? Apparently. Or the North Africans, so that's where the actual civil war comes in, and there's a bunch of interesting texts that were written about this time, in which I would make the argument who was right is the Berbers, every single time. Because there's no racial superiority in Islam. But racism exists. Sorry, yeah.
So even with this racist divide, it's still the army was still united enough to take over Spain,
Yeah.
even though they had internal problems.
Yeah, the origins of it was when lands were being divided, they would constantly be favoring the Arabs that were coming from farther away rather than the North African Berbers. So it didn't completely start as a civil war, it was just like factions amongst the armies themselves, and then eventually it led to them saying, no, our ruler should be next, our ruler should be next.
Okay, so this happened. This kind of happened after like the initial conquest, seemed to
Yeah.
worsen.
That's why it's like 732, not like right
Later.
away.
Oh,
No.
okay.
That's a really good question, yes.
Even the Berber name was some kind of racist, right? Because it came from barbarian, but they didn't call themselves that.
No, so Berber is before the term barbarian.
Okay, so it's not.
It's the other way around.
Okay, well, they used to call them Tennessee, something like that.
Yeah. So yes, the term Berber is an insult the term barbarian is an insult to this term, not the other way around. Make sense? Okay. Yes.
So what were the Muslims like fighting between each other about?
It was who gets to be the next leaders, which is the typical thing that people fight over. Should it be the Arabs who have, like, or Arab, the Arab superiority, that type of thing, or should it be anyone who shows merit? That's where the Badrs would be. So, that period, I already told you things to consider about the conquest. Then you need a uniting force, and that uniting force ends up being Abdurrahman, the Umayyad survivor, Al-Shaheen. And what happens here is, if you go back to our study of the Abbasid revolution, remember they lock all the Umayyads into one room, claiming that they have something to discuss with them, and then kill them all. Abdurrahman gets tipped off that that's actually what's occurring there, so he runs off to first North Africa, and then goes from there to Spain. And he's used as a perfect kind of, look, we're having a civil war anyway, let's just get a ruler that everyone can accept. So he becomes the Amir from there, like, no, this is someone, not just the Arabs from amongst us, but he was recognized as a ruler. Little do they know, of course, that when he gets there, the Abbasids are now ruling Baghdad, not the Umayyads anymore, but that's a whole, like, kind of interesting fact of history in terms of, they use that to justify his rulership, without hearing about the rest of the Umayyads have been killed. So, interesting how that works. But he rules, installing himself as the Amir. It's interesting, the Yemeni allow him to take power because they didn't like the Syrian governors imposed by Baghdad before. So he's seen as like a savior, and a change from the, like, what was happening before. So he's very smart as a political ruler as well to make this happen. And the governor he defeated goes northern Spain and tries to come back, but then he just has challenges over and over again. And a couple of things on his side is there's the Shi'i revolts that were taking place. He kind of takes advantage of them to some extent by quelling them and giving them some favors here and there. The Berber revolts also starts happening that he notices are taking place, so he quells it a little bit. This will be a constant battle that happens in Spain, is the North Africans and the quote-unquote Arabs will constantly be at odds with each other, but he ends up taking advantage of that. And then the other thing he has to deal with all the time is the Abbasids, once they figure out what he's done in Spain, keep sending ambassadors to say, no, join back. You guys want to be your own thing? No, why don't you join the bigger ummah collectively? But each time they do that, the ambassador gets beheaded. So they, like, cut off relationships with the ruling party in Baghdad itself. So that keeps happening. And the last thing to say is the Franks are a common enemy that he unites over. But don't fight each other, guys. Let's go fight the Franks, like the French. So that's a reason he's able to kind of keep things together. At this time, once the Umayyad dynasty comes in, this is going to be a long time, but a little bit later, Charlemagne, like the Charlemagne, tries to invade to recover those areas of France that had been lost, but he gets defeated pretty badly. I actually don't know why he's revered as such a crazy figure, because he does not have any military success really against the Muslims. And this is the time in which we'll discuss in kind of depth here. There's lots of cultural things that takes place. That Spain starts becoming slowly Arabized. You could make the argument it's not Arab, it's Muslim, but there's a lot of cultural exchange that happens here, and the children of Christians in Spain, the Muslims will almost never become a majority in Spain. They will be a very significant minority, up to like 40, 50%, touching 50%, they will never pass 50%. But the children of the Christians prefer Arabic to Spanish as their tongue, as their mother tongue. And actually Spanish wouldn't have been as Spanish exists today, it would have been much more closely related to Latin at that point. And they prefer Arab culture, and even religion. So there's a constant degree of resistance of generations even. All the younger people are speaking Arabic and really associated with Muslim culture. This would be like a precursor of what Crusaders experienced in Jerusalem before that ever was happening in Spain. And there's even an interesting cultural phenomenon. There's a really good book on this written by Dorothy Harith, I believe. The period of martyrdoms, assisted suicide by Muslim. And what that means is a bunch of people, if they wanted to commit suicide and they were feeling depressed about things, they would say, go to a public place and say blasphemy about the Prophet ﷺ, knowing full well that that would earn them the death penalty. So you actually have Muslim scholars debating and getting into this conversation of, should we actually have that policy for someone who is mentally ill, because they consider them mentally ill? Spain would also be amongst the first places in which you have conversations around mental health and hospitals where people could actually get have their minds diagnosed. These places called Maristan started opening up, which was a place to manage your mental pain and anguish, where they'd use like art therapy and like aromatherapy and these other things to try to cure people who are dealing with the diseases of the mind. So just kind of interesting. But this happens. They would, in terms of like the period of martyrdoms that exist, but that tells you also the amount of cultural exchange happening with the Christians was much more significant in Spain than anywhere else really in the Muslim world. And of course everyone likes the 786 thing. In the year 786, I don't even know if that's actually true, but it's put forward as it is. The Mosque of Cordoba began, and Cordoba would be this place where there's a lot of cultural exchange and also knowledge being both produced and translated. Becomes a translation house where a bunch of Greek texts, a bunch of Latin texts are converted into Arabic, and then eventually Arabic is converted into Spanish and into French and sent off into Europe as well. And then the other thing that's really interesting here is Spain was never seen as a agricultural hub before the Muslims get to it. My teacher used to always say is Spain is where Europe learned how to do proper agriculture. But I want you to think about it from the Muslim perspective. Muslims have been ruling lands that are mainly deserts. Especially, that's not even called Muslims. North Africans have been ruling in lands where it's mainly deserts for a while. They get to Spain, and they're like, oh my gosh, you guys have all of this fertile land but don't know how to use it. Because they had learned how to do a lot with a little. So they get there, and they're like, this is the most fertile land on earth. And they teach them how to use, the major problem was waterways weren't really well put together in Spain. They're like, we know how to be efficient with water. So agriculture booms under the Muslims so significant. Because what? You're dealing with people who have had to do with a lot less, and now that there's so much plenty of it, they're able to actually really expand economically what Spain was able to produce. Spain goes from being a place where resources are shipped to an actual exporter under the Umayyad rule. So briefly, it's a dynasty in the way a dynasty typically runs. Abdurrahman gives over to Hisham, gives to Hakam, gives to Abdurrahman II, gives to Muhammad, Mundhir, and then finally there's some oddness that goes off between Abdullah and Mundhir. I think he kills him. Anyway, then you have, it's typical dynasty stuff. And then Abdurrahman III, who we're going to talk about there, under him things separate a little bit and there's going to be another civil war. Not really a civil war though, at this point it's too big to be governed by one person, so they divide up Spain into its many different parts. That's generally how things kind of take place. There are 15 major khalifas that are found throughout here. Why it's going through one line is because at this point it splits with these other people. I'm not going to go over this too much. Father to son and all, and then Abdurrahman III for 50 years. And I want you to think about it. It's actually, compared to the Abbasids, who had a 50-year rule? Didn't really exist. So for the most part, this was actually pretty peaceful transitions of power, at least in terms of how dynasties go. Because typically dynasties, you're like 10, 15-year rules, and then this happens, and there's a coup, and this takes place, and all of this happens. Not really happening here in Spain all that much. It happens once in a while, but that isn't the rule. And something interesting though with Abdurrahman III, he's the first person to take on the title of Khalifa rather than Amir. Because before this, they were like, we don't want to upset the Abbasids too much by calling ourselves a direct Khalifa. Because why? The Abbasids still are claiming to be the Khalifa of the entire Ummah of Muslims. So they don't want to ruffle the feathers too much, we're just an Amir. But Abdurrahman III decides to take the title of Khalifa, and why at 928 does he do that? Because at this point so many people are doing it. Remember, this is when the divided Khilafah, or the Shi'i century, is taking place. So he feels confident enough to do that, and he was called Abdurrahman al-Nasir ad-Dinullah, the helper of the deen of Allah. It's like the title he takes on for himself. And he becomes a Khalifa, even though he rules from 912 to 961, he becomes a Khalifa in 928. And a couple of things he had to deal with was the Fatimids coming from North Africa. Fatimids are trying to stretch they hadn't yet taken over Cairo, or Egypt, but they try to come in, and then he also has to deal with Christians who start trying to invade from the north, but it doesn't really succeed at this point. This is when it's considered the golden age of the Muslims for most people, will be in this late Umayyad era. Because you've dealt with most of the actual militaristic threats that were there, and they've really established themselves in the culture of Muslim Spain, and they have a way of dealing with the minorities that exist, providing them to live with dignity. And that is really what leads to a golden age. Is not as soon as you conquer, but after the conquering has taken place and you sit and the local minorities are no longer upset, but they're actually integrated as part of the community itself. How do you deal? And we'll talk about that in a little bit. They were able to find a balance between the power of the Berbers and the Arabs, and how they did that is pretty terrible, but by importing Frankish slaves. I know that sounds terrible, but what I mean by that is the Berbers and the Arabs no longer were fighting amongst each other because there was a new model minority who was excluded from power. It was the Franks who kept coming in. And why were the Franks coming into Spain? Because economically Spain was so much more powerful that French people would actually tell their children to go into Spain. Non-Muslims, like Christians, would tell them to go into Spain because you get better life there. And you hear about all of this of like, Muslims were like the intellectual capital of the world. This is actually at this time that the lingua franca became, all of Europe would come to Arab lands, at least all of Western Europe would come to Arab lands in order to be educated in this place. Agriculture was flourishing, which we talked about last time. In Cordoba University, my teacher used to always say, high culture was taught to Europe from Cordoba. When it comes to most of the practices that you think of today, even the establishment of universities like Cambridge, ironically happens right in 928. Okay, so happens there. Why? Because they actually take on the Ijaza system of the Azharis. Is actually where even the origins of things like Cambridge are actually sent off there. Even the French language, not the French, the Spanish language starts becoming very Arabized. One of the things that like Spanish is known for is like the troubadour tradition. It's actually just mutrib, like the singer. That's where this is. There's so many Spanish words that are like the ustada form in Spanish. Where does that come from? Ustad in Arabi is actually where that comes. Like all of these types of things are taken directly from Arabi into Spanish itself. The language itself starts to transform, and then eventually gets defeated by northern Christians, and the Franks actually finally kind of fight back. And then from 931 onward, you're going to start to see decadence, and decadence will be Muslims not focusing on expansion anymore and losing lands over and over again, and focusing more on the arts than actually focusing on political rule or anything. So that's there, and then we'll talk about the decadence that takes place after Abdurrahman III. But that's we'll talk about what some of that golden age ended up being like. But I'll talk about a couple of things. After Abdurrahman III is Al-Hakam II, and after his rule, so Al-Hakam holds it together to some extent, but it's really chaotic after that, where you have a bunch of different Muslim rulers like fighting amongst themselves, sometimes partnering up with an invading Frank army, sometimes with the local Spanish army. It gets really divided really quickly after that. So Hisham II takes over. He doesn't really take over. It's his advisor. He's a 12-year-old kid who Al-Mansur, the Yemeni advisor, actually like puts into the thrones, claiming that he's from a much more noble lineage. And he gets a bunch of ulama on their side, and this happens again. I think there's a power issue with this TV. Unless someone's doing this. Okay. He gets the ulama on his side by burning the library of Hakam, who came before this, because there's this version of the mihna that takes place. Like, he's so supported by philosophy, instead let's burn it back and get back to the sunnah. But it's really a political ploy at the end of the day, kind of like the Salafis get used, by certain states that want to justify them as being pure Islam once again. Where do they get all their books from? Oh, okay. But anyway, he gets his legitimacy through there. He uses Moroccan mercenaries instead of Frankish slaves to actually be a part of his army. And you'll see Hisham II is really known because this will be the first time that Muslims start use non-Muslim forces in order to like push back Muslims from their own rule happening in Spain, but it'll happen over and over again. Don't know what that is. Okay, this becomes the most central area for resistance from Christian Spain against the Moors, which will be the area of Cordoba itself. Anarchy starts taking place with the two sons of Al-Mansur, Abd al-Malik al-Muzaffar and Shangul. That happens, and Hisham III abolished the Khilafah because the power at the hands of the Berbers and the Europeans was too much. And when he gets ousted from the rule of the Umayyads, he gets really ousted. And the stories actually say that he had to beg for food for his children while he's in jail rotting away, and he's in jail for like years, and he gets starved. While a bunch of these generals and rulers are actually starting to divide up this dynasty that used to be the Umayyad Empire. All of this was happening while some of the intellectual giants that we celebrate today, like Ibn Hazm, he's a really interesting Islamic scholar that the madhahib had already been established. The four major madhahib had already been established, but Ibn Hazm goes, nope, all of you need to stop doing taqleed, which is stop relying on other people to tell you what your religion says. Go back to the Quran and Sunnah itself. And he writes a very interesting text, Al-Muhalla, which is, it says don't follow madhahib, and essentially he makes his own madhab, which is the Zahiri madhab, but the whole idea of it, it's Salafis before Salafi were a thing. Which he's like, you need proof for anything that you do, and there were certain things. Everyone, not everyone, but many people like saying, the Zahiris are so like, permissive of things like music. They are. They're among the only ones that actually say it's mustahab to listen to music, as long as it has a good message. Everybody's like, yeah! But then they also will say, you are not allowed to eat unless you have checked in with 40 of your neighbors to see whether they have food or not. Because why? There's a hadith. They are very literalist when it comes to interpreting hadith in the Quran. That's why they call it Zahiri. Whatever is outward is there. But he puts this forward, and he's very, very strict when it comes to fiqh, to be literalist. But on other things, he writes one of the most awesome treatises ever written on love in Islam. It's called Thawq al-Hamam. It's not Fawq al-Hamam, that's a misspelling on my hand. Thawq al-Hamam, the ring of the dove. This idea of like, no, Islam has hidden deeper meanings as to why it mandates certain relationships to be valued. So you have all this type of stuff coming from Spain. That's why I say it's an exception to what the rest of the Ummah is facing. Because they have to be strict, because they have to separate themselves from Christianity and Judaism a lot. But intellectually, they're like, let's dig deeper. Because why? Fiqh-wise, we're different, but let's look for those universal themes that actually unite us. It's like Spain in a nutshell. So I'll do one more era of this and then get into the golden age of Spain. Yes?
I have two questions.
Yes.
One is, what is the picture over on the right? Actually, the two pictures.
So, Cordoba and Granada.
Okay.
Some of the most amazing Muslim architecture that has ever been made. Actually, I believe that's Alhambra, my apologies. But Alhambra and Granada. But some of the most amazing Muslim architecture that's ever been made. But it's ruins. What I mean by ruins, you know how like when you go and see the pyramids? Okay, let's not say the pyramids, that's a weird example. But like, you're like, who built that? Wow, are they still around? It's like, no, aliens. Okay, but that's honestly kind of like what happens here. When you go to Spain today and you see a Muslim community and you ask the question, oh wow, are they living here since then? The Muslims who are in Spain right now are not the ones who built any of this stuff. They were completely wiped out and eradicated. I know. Now they're only talked about in museums there. That's why I put that forward. And there's, we'll get to this in about half hour actually, so not too long from now. But there'll even be conversations that as the armies were coming to kill the Muslims, they were still carving calligraphy into the walls. Like, let me at least finish this before I die. It's like, it's kind of crazy. Yes?
I have a question of the last bullet. Why did he abolish the Khalifa?
Because he didn't have any power. So he's actually a pretty tragic figure where he realizes he has no power, so it's wrong for him to call it a khilafah.
And why did he lose power?
because people are fighting amongst themselves, and because as the Franks and others are kind of invading into Spain, they're like, people are siding and getting quote unquote material gain. They're getting their own little dynasty, their own little area to expand rather than focusing on preserving the dynasty of the Muslims.
But, like what you were saying, like the Franks were mainly coming in as slaves. How were they coming
They
in
were
also as-
until they get. One of the interesting things about Muslims in Spain is Muslims, whenever they took slaves in, those slaves end up becoming rulers
Yeah,
within a
like that's
couple-
kind of like my question. Like, how did that happen?
within a couple of generations, and I think that's a civilizational question to be had. You could say the same thing about that's what America does, right? That America hires a bunch of Asians to build the railroad system. And who's ruling? Who's now in charge of a bunch of the biggest corporations in the country, right? So this is like whenever there's a meritocracy, that's what tends to happen. Is those that were treated like the downtrodden in that community, as long as there's social mobility and not a theology that suppresses.
Oh my God, the book.
Okay, we're gonna continue. Where were we? Oh yes, yes. What was your question?
Loosely related to the document, that just made me think of it.
Yeah.
When did the whole what's it called, Quran Quran thing start?
That's happened a couple of different times in history, but it never lasted more than a generation. That's why even what's happening today, I don't think it's gonna last more than a generation. So, this wouldn't, Ibn Hazm is not known as a Qurani.
Yeah, it's just the notion of leave everything else, just stick with the original text. It made me think of one step further, basically.
Yeah. It happened every so often, but it very quickly gets dismantled because they realize you can't actually build a religion without it.
So it's never organized.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because it falls apart.
Yeah.
People are like, oh wait, we can't address everything from this. Where do we, our commentary of the Quran comes from? Oh, hadith. It's a cyclical argument. This keeps going back. Yes.
Building off of that, I actually also had a question about like the premise of the madhab. So it's saying that like it's very literal in terms it needs Quranic proof for everything that you do. Did it also accept hadith?
Yes. So it needed textual proof for everything that you do,
It
which means
needs
either
textual
Quran
proof.
or hadith.
So it isn't like pure like Qurani,
No.
but this is like that's just like a filtered version of
Yeah.
this.
But the argument is very similar that Ibn Hazm will say things like music. He's like, there's not a single one narration that says music is haram, that's allowed. Right? So he'd be very open to stuff like that. And he'd even say that certain types of wine, for example, if they are not khamar, if they were called something else or had a different effect, that they're allowed. Because if you had to have something literal that said it was allowed, or not allowed or allowed.
And how does that contrast to Salafism?
It's a version of Salafism. Salafism, if you think about it this way, the reason he would be different is he doesn't completely reject philosophy and applying things like this to theology. That's why it wouldn't be it has elements of Salafism in it, but it's not complete Salafism as you'd see the political manifestation of it in the last 100 years. Yes?
So, this Bahiri variety, is this the majority of the version of Islam that was enjoyed?
It would be very popular in Andalus. I don't know if it would ever be majority though. Ibn Hazm is very well regarded at his time.
What was the majority?
It would have been the traditional madhahib structure. So it would have been mainly Maliki. But yes, it would be just like the traditional, there'd probably be a break of Malikis and probably a lot of Hanafis.
And is it like a manhaj or is it madhab of fiqh?
They would be a proper madhab. Yeah. Yes. You'll have other people who will have a lot of tariqas in Spain, but this would be fiqh. Yes. All right, so now moving forward. So you know just how divided Muluk al-Taifas or Reis de Taifas is. I want you to just look at this thing. There are 15 different Muslim kingdoms within Spain. I'm not going to read all of them. I'll give you Banu Mazain, the Bahris, Banu Bizil, Banu Hamud, Banu Jawhar, Banu Zir, Banu Samuel. Somadi, that's interesting. I didn't know that was his name. Okay, Banu Razin, Banu Qasim, who goes, of course, that one goes all the way back, saying that they were going to Prophet Sallallahu Amirids, Banu Had, Banu Dhul Nun, like assuming Yusha, Banu Altaf, Aftas, Banu Addad, Amirids of Daniya. As you can see, there's so many of them all throughout. And some of them are in partnerships with each other, that's where the colors are for, and some of them are in opposition to each other. So, as you can see, it is divided into total, quote-unquote, chaos. Though it's chaos, something interesting is you'll have some of the most intellectually significant Muslims produced at this era. Though it is kind of crazy like this. Which begs the question, does Islam eventually lead to decentralized power? That's a consistent question to be had all throughout Muslim history. That the answer seems to be we continuously go back to decentralized power rather than centralized power. Might be the natural state of the But let's continue. A couple of things to know. I'm not going to go through all 15. Of course not. Yes.
So how do you start a kingdom in this, like in this era? Because a lot of these look pretty. I mean, I don't know if I can fully get the scale of it, but they look pretty small.
Yeah. You take a city.
And that city is your kingdom.
Yeah.
Can we take New Brunswick?
We are awesome citizens of every place that we are. No. We don't take over places. Hashtag creeping Sharia. Anyway, so this era lasts approximately 60 years. Look how divided everything is, 15 different rules. Every city has an autonomous rule. But this is where I'll say, are they autonomous? Do they even fight amongst each other from time to time? Yes, but is it fighting to the point of like trying to eradicate each other? No. This is the equivalent, I can also say, of like, how companies compete with each other? Do they want to kill each other? No, they want to absorb the other person's resources. Yeah, that's kind of what's happening here. That makes sense? Okay. Something interesting is the Christians benefit from this type of division because there's times in which Muslim rulers partner with invading Christians if it serves them right. Toledo is the first important land loss that the Muslims experience at this time, which is it used to be the capital of the Visigoths 3 centuries earlier. And then later Muslims take it back and it kind of gets lost. Huge cultural centers where translations take place. So even though all of this craziness is going on, each of these cities, one beautiful thing about being separated is they all kind of cross-pollinate and they're competing with each other, not just in resources and politics, they also compete in intellectual production. So that's why I say, this is going to sound terrible because everyone's like, division is bad. True, but is division really bad? Because isn't it what leads to economic progress and societal and cultural progress as well? Spain is an interesting place to see that happen. You're going to have this general chain, Greek to Arabic to Latin. That's the, you can't actually have translations of many Greek texts without it passing through Arabic first. So what those who want to erase Muslims from the chain say, it went Greek to Latin. There's no evidence that texts were translated from Greek to Latin. They went Greek, Arabic for a generation, then to Latin. So just kind of interesting there. And then knowledge is being passed on in Greece to Baghdad, Spain to Europe. That's the other kind of exchange that happens here. Some of the most major names, like Ibn Sina, I don't know why I gave the anglicized version of that, Ghazali, Ibn Rushd, al-Balkhi, they're all kind of coming from this time period at this time. But while that intellectual capital is being completely produced, Muslims are systematically losing lands. The Muslims of Badajoz, one of the awesomest places, named places anyway, call on al-Moravids from Africa to help them defend all of these lands that are being lost. But something interesting, they come from Morocco, they do some really cool stuff, they create the city of Marrakesh, amazing city. They make the city of Fez, but they come in and they're like, we like it here. We're gonna stay. So the Almoravids then take over first, the Badajoz, and then like 7 other of these small Muslim rulerships get taken over by the Almoravids. Because why you imported them from North Africa, and they're like, nope, we're staying. Would they stay? So then we get into the Almoravid dynasty for the next 50 years, which is right here. They come from the south of Morocco, go to Spain. They take Granada in 1090, which would have been like that's the Muslims supposed to be the Muslim military stronghold, and they establish themselves in Sabella the very next year. And this is going to be the first time that Spain is controlled by North Africans and not the other way around. Meaning that what was happening earlier is that Spain would consistently send people to North Africa because they needed their trade routes to kind of be put together. Now North Africa is controlling Spain, so it's kind of interesting. And also they start recognizing the authority of Baghdad. So it's a flip from the Umayyads. They're like, nope, we're going to connect ourselves back to the Ummah in that way. And they take the civilization of Andalus over to Africa. That posh lifestyle that they've been developing, they start exporting the lifestyle out also to North Africa in this time as well. And the other thing is, anytime a new group comes in, they're not going to be nearly as diverse when it comes to theological and fiqh practices. So they actually go back to a very, Almoravids would have been much more closely related to what we would call Salafis today. And even more, this will be the Al-Muwahhids or Al-Muhads that come after. They do not like Ghazali at all. Why? Because Ghazali has a lot of falsafa that he's incorporated, they would say, into this. It's corrupted Islam in some way. So there's their most important name that takes over is Yusuf Deshufin, who reigns for about almost 50 years in there. And then the major thing that they do is they rebuild Qarawiyun Mosque, which had been destroyed for a while, by creating the actual city of Marrakesh. That's the Almoravids. My teacher used to describe them as it is a gang of ruffians who adopt a really posh lifestyle. I don't know. I haven't studied them in depth enough to make that conclusion like him, but I trust him. Yes.
So it says they took Granada in 1090.
Yes.
And Granada was taken, and I think Jerusalem was taken? Or
Jerusalem is 1087. Oh, no. Jerusalem was, yeah. So it's
okay.
Before then, yeah.
Before then, okay. Yeah, I thought like both of those happened in the same year, which I thought was interesting.
Yeah.
But it's like similar stories.
To some extent. Except this will be much more tragic. We're about to get there. Same thing happens. The Almoravids eventually are facing some people invading from the north and infighting. So they decide, let's go get another group from North Africa. So they bring in the Al-Muwahhidun or Al-Muhads. And they come in and very similarly take over all of Spain. I didn't get any of the names or anything, but this is the Almohad rulers. They do the same thing. They come in and completely take the Muslim portions of Spain, and the north gets kind of lost at this point. So that's the Almohads. And it would be a very similar story. It would be like, wait, you didn't learn from last time? Yeah, apparently you did. Well, anytime you bring in someone to just fight your military battles for you, trust me, they're going to rule over you. Because if you outsource your military, what's of course going to happen? It's going to turn on you next. That's what ends up happening with the Almohads as well. One of the major kind of Ibn Tumart will be the major ruler of the Almohads. That's really there. He has a couple of interesting theological perspectives. He calls himself the Mahdi, and the reason he does that is he wants the real Mahdi to show up. In our history, anyone who has ever tried to bring about end times, it's not ended well, and it's not gone well. That's why our scholars have actually said, you do not ever do that. But anyway, why it doesn't end up well? His sons form their own dynasties and fight amongst each other as a result of it, but they kind of go down. Something cool about them is they were among the first of the Spanish Muslim rulers that actually started building fort cities. It doesn't help them though, because it's a little too late. Little too late, because they'll be militarily successful, but it's a typical story of what happens in Spain. They become militarily successful, then they get too caught up with the lifestyle, and they stop focusing on the military, and then they get conquered by the very next group that shows up. It's almost poetic that they say that Spain's biggest downfall is how rich and how what's the term I'm looking for? Romantic the atmosphere is there. That you'll get there, you'll conquer it, then you'll pretend like you're on heaven on earth, and then you'll be conquered by the very next people. So we would call that love of this dunya. That's what keeps happening. And that's also going to be why Spain produces, we'll talk about this now for a little bit, the next 10 minutes or so, why Spain produces some of the most amazing Muslim minds that we've ever, that history records, right? Part of it is because if there's such rampant materialism, what do you need? Really, really good spiritual counters to that materialism. So you'll see that happening with figures like Ibn Arabi, who has the most complicated metaphysics that has been produced by the Muslim world. He's called Sheikh al-Akbar, the Grand Sheikh, and he writes a text called the Wahdat al-Wujud. Anyone ever heard of it? It's called the Unity of Being, but it's like this crazy metaphysics of how the universe itself runs, how God's sunnah kind of exists on this earth. And he writes also a tafsir known as Fusus al-Hakam, the bezels of wisdom, and the Fath al-Makki, the Meccan revelations, which comments on, among the first times you have a whole text on just the Meccan revelations versus like the tafsir in its totality. You can't study any mysticism in the Islamic tradition without really understanding and appreciating the contributions of someone like Ibn Arabi. And one of the things that he's doing is he benefits a lot from there's Christians and Jews who are present, and he incorporates a lot of their ideas into Islamic philosophy as well. He takes a lot of what the Greeks and like philosophers would have had, but then he Islamicizes it pretty significantly. So Ibn Arabi is just like a very interesting figure. If you ever want to get confused for a night, just go read some Ibn Arabi. That's another way of actually realizing him for those of us who are not as metaphysically inclined, including myself. You'll have people like Al-Qurtubi. You cannot have a book of tafsir today without quoting Al-Qurtubi. Qurtubi is literally his kunya, because his actual name is Abu Abdullah Muhammad ibn Ahmad al-Ansari. But he's called Al-Qurtubi because he's the most well-known scholars of Cordoba. So he's Qurtubi, that's what he's kind of named after. He puts together Al-Jamil Ahkam al-Quran, which is the most quoted tafsir for the next like 400, 500 years. Even today, you'll have Qurtubi like quoted many times. If you look into the margins of like who said this opinion first, it's oftentimes will be Qurtubi. And one of the things that it's really known for is its a mastery of the Arabic language. And it incorporates Maliki law and law precedents into tafsir itself. So he's kind of combining tafsir Quran interpretation with how scholars have commented and actually ruled by for the last couple hundred years. So Qurtubi is there. Ibn Tufail, one of my favorite authors. He writes a book called Hayy ibn Yaqzan, which is a text in which he asks a bunch of philosophical questions. If a man was to be if a baby was the only survivor of a shipwrecked place and he never interacted with anyone else, well, how would he be judged by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? What is the actual natural state of man? So he asks these type of really philosophical questions. What happens to someone who never got exposed to revelation? What happens to someone that got exposed to bad forms of revelation? So a lot of that, this idea of nature versus nurture, that's put forward. A lot of this actually starts here, and his writings will actually be the precursors of like John Locke and Daniel Defoe. John Locke, who's considered like the founder of like what democracy, I guess, or the ideas that lead into the Enlightenment. Read a lot of texts by Ibn Tufayl in this of like these philosophical origins. Ibn Sabi'in. A mystic and philosopher known to be like the father of Gnosticism. This idea that knowing things and knowing society is the whole purpose of all of creation to be produced. That he's quoted with the it's sometimes attributed to a weak hadith, but he quotes it all the time. That God says that God was a treasure that was unknown, so He created the universe so that He may be known. Will be like the Gnostic idea of why we exist. So that'll be there as well, but you can also see how these are the origins of the Enlightenment. Because why? It's this idea of a very poetic and ability of appreciating the nature that's kind of around them. And then, of course, Ibn Khaldun, who is the first real historian of world history. World history was not a thing yet. Ibn Khaldun writes, it's a little bit later, so he's among the latest of this. He's in 1300s to he was born in 1332, dies in 1406. But he writes a history of the world from the creation of the universe up until where he is now. That had not been done, and he writes it. And not only does he write it, but he goes into depth of explaining things as not just a God willed it so it happened, but these were the societal trends that caused the Sunnah of Allah to be formed. So he's often credited as being the first sociologist, not just the first historian. That makes sense? But here, now I gotta ask the question to you guys. Why did all of these amazing firsts emerge in Spain? What do you guys think, from what I've told you so far? Yes?
Because they were chilling, so they had the time to.
They were chilling, so they had the time. Great. Yeah, you can make that argument, but it's not as if there's no time anywhere else.
Is it the competition that you were talking about that really, like sped up the intellectual like rise between them?
Yeah, so there's constant competition between people. So each one's trying to one up the other, and these amazing names come out as a way to distinguish themselves. That's one part of it. And Spain geographically also just has this quality associated with it, is you don't need to rely on the person on the other side of the country. It's a bunch of small lakes, rivers, and stuff all over the place. So you don't need one place to really all gather together. You have your own little self-sustaining things, but it's close enough to each other where you can constantly interact with each other. So, yeah, that's part of it. Yes?
No, I was just gonna ask if this, like, do most of these names or all of these names come from that Muluk al-Tawafir
Yeah.
era? Like,
Most of them other than Ibn Khaldun.
Okay.
Yeah. I'll give a couple of other reasons. There's a beautiful interaction between Muslims, Christians, and Jews. Moses Maimonides is considered the rabbi after Moses, the first one, after Musa. He's considered the greatest Jewish scholar since Moses. You know what language he spoke? Arabic. You know who he would write letters with? Ibn Taymiyyah. Under Muslim Spain. There's a rewriting of history that's taking place now. We're trying to say, no, they were actually oppressed the whole time. Historically, before the birth of Zionism, everyone always looked at what was the best time for the Jewish community was here. So this time. Because there was this idea of like, we have a bunch of minorities and we're going to interact with them. That's what ends up happening. Was it perfect? Of course not. And I'm going to get into why it wasn't perfect as for the next 20 minutes or so. But there seems to be this beautiful kind of combination of a couple of things. One, faith and intellect, unity of knowledge and worship, Quran-inspired exploration, and nature of self. That though they disagreed politically, theologically, the rulers were all kind of in the same place. So they kind of hired scholars to do that, and there was this perfect idea of like, there's not other influences, it's just monotheism that's running the way. So this is where like, for a Muslim, it's like, that's going to lead to some cool intellectual and social developments. That's there. Aesthetic and spiritual sensibility. There's appreciation of beauty and refinement. Integration of form and content that starts to take place. There's prosperity and stability. It's generally, poverty is almost non-existent in this part of the world, which is insane. So that leads to some significant situations there. I already talked about pluralism and tolerance. Muslims, Jews, and Christians all kind of lived together, and they constantly sparred with each other, and that led to some of the best ideas rising to the surface. And finally, it was there was synthesis through the philosophy of what came in the past. They became beneficiaries of everything that was being done in Baghdad. They were also competing with their own selves, because I want you to think about it this way. When Muslims only compete with non-Muslims, Muslims don't get to compete with Muslims. I want you to think about that. They don't get to compete with Muslims. Spain has a perfect foil, Baghdad. So we need to one-up the other Muslims in what they're producing. That constantly keeps happening in Spain as well. And it produces something kind of beautiful. And they can't beat them. This is going to be their downfall too. They can't beat them militarily, so they're going to beat them in the arts. Spain keeps exporting what? Culture, poetry, art, philosophy. They don't have much of a military. Part of the reason is because they didn't face the Crusaders the same way that the others did, or the Mongols. But they never developed militarily as a result of that. Yes?
I was gonna ask, so when we talk about like the golden age, is that localized to Spain, or does it include like the how it is?
It includes them because you have some amazing works there, but comparing the populations of the Muslims in Spain versus the rest of the Muslim world, the amount of names being produced in Spain is so disproportionate it doesn't make sense.
And were they at the same time?
Yeah, it's relatively at the same time. Spain is producing so much more.
And like that, they were under the Abbasids and while these were under the Umayyads.
Yeah.
At the same time.
At the same time, yeah.
Why didn't the Abbasids ever try?
They did. They sent them over, but they're so geographically removed that they couldn't. And they were already worrying about a bunch of other problems that they were dealing with, so they never tried to invade Spain again. Because you remember, to invade Spain, you need a massive force. And we were like, wait, what are we invading for, other Muslim rulers? No. Like, they're also split up in the Muslim world, like in the rest of the Middle East as well.
And I don't know if this relates, but when did like Sufism like arise?
The entire time, and there'll be movements against them over and over again. So Sufism never just pops up once. There's also many dimensions of Sufism that exist, but there's tariqas, khanqahs, and all these type of things already existing here. Zawiyas will be big in Spain. A zawiya will be this idea: if there's a major scholar that you really like, it's typically a rich person, buy land for them and tell them, we'll take care of all of your needs, you just keep teaching. And your entire way of life will be preserved here. So it's like an endowment. Or, I guess it's like an endowment that takes care of all of a scholar's needs so that they don't have to worry about the things of this world anymore, so they can just focus on kind of teaching and developing what knowledge Allah has given them. Yes?
I had a question. What's the root meaning of Andalusia? Why was that the name that was given for this region of the Muslim world?
I don't know. I'll have to look it up. My apologies. Yes?
So I understand why the Christians went after Jerusalem, obviously, at the beginning of the Crusades, but they never look at Spain, saying like, hey, we want to take back what's ours.
The Franks don't join. Because remember, the Crusades are mainly partnership. At the first, it's the Western Roman Empire and Eastern Roman Empire, so like the leftover of the Western Roman Empire, and then Pope Urban II from the Byzantines, right? Spain's doing its own thing. It's just a bunch of barbarian tribes that are there.
So
It's not united.
So geographically, it would just be the two empires going south, effectively. Whereas if they wanted to go for Spain, they'd have to go west and through another.
They have to go all the way from the north first.
Right.
They're not going. It's disconnected from the Mediterranean.
Yep.
That's what makes it problematic. I'm going to continue. Last time we're going to look at this map, all right? Remember the map last time was 15 different Muslim places? The next timeline, 1232 to 1492. What does 1492 sound familiar with? 1492, when Columbus sailed the ocean blue. Okay, we'll talk about that in a second. But anyway, look at the map now. The Muslim lands is in green. The rest of it, Kingdom of Aragon, Kingdom of Leon, Kingdom of Portugal, started to happen. And they keep pushing further and further up until Granada will be the last little area that the Muslims will actually rule. Cordoba will fall, and then there'll be a little sliver in Granada, and they will fall as well. Yeah.
Is there a pushback? Why do they keep?
Muslims keep losing land.
Just by and they didn't try to get it back, or
They never could get it back.
accepting it because they were not strong militarily.
At this time, though, this is being built. And this is what I mean by it was so unfortunate that as the Muslims are being taken over, there's actually, this is the House of Cordoba, that they're chiseling calligraphy into the pillars, and even as they're being like taken over, they're like, let me just finish my one thing, then I'll go and be thrown into prison. They're just focusing on the arts over and over and over again because militarily they know they are not going to win. Yes.
So I know that you would help them because the other part of the Ummah is doing the same kind of
The other part of the Ummah, in this case, is dealing with their own problems with the Mongols.
the same
We check certain groups of people by other groups of people. Remember, that's the ayah we opened with. So that happens. Not to be blasphemous, Jannatin min tahtiha al-anhar, gardens underneath which rivers flow. What did it seem like they were trying to do? Trying to recreate Jannah on earth. Seems to be kind of, and the reason they adopt this motif is to make it look like it's infinite. This creates an optical illusion. I don't know if any of you have ever been into a place like this. Even Medina, the Masjid Nabawi has this. But you look down, it looks like it goes on forever because of the contrast. When there's contrast in front of your eyes, your eye can't really handle it, so it gives the optical illusion that it's just going on over and over again. They tried to replicate infinity in their architecture. Were we ever supposed to have vastness think about infinity on earth? Answer is no. So this is where I'll be like, they got so lost into the metaphysics that it didn't actually allow them to have dominion on earth anymore. Kind of interesting to think about. So whenever someone tells me like, well, Muslims should just go strictly into the arts and like this and this and this, I'm like, yeah, they did that. And what happened? They didn't last. Yes?
I was asking, why does it look similar to certain masajid in Egypt, like the architecture, like the colors and everything?
This will be adopted by those in Egypt. So that's what like Abdullah ibn Amr ibn As's masjid looks like, right?
Mhm.
That's later adopted by them from here. Yeah. Yeah. Anyone ever been to Alhambra? The coolest, the coolest calligraphy anywhere in the world where, depending on what time of the day it is and where the sunlight is hitting it, it'll be different verses shown on the wall. I want you to think about how intricate you have to be. So if the light is coming this way, a different pattern and verse. If the light's coming this way, a different pattern and verse. The light's coming this way, a different pattern and verse. Isn't that so cool? I gotta ask, what did they make it all for? Literally the years it was completed was the years it was taken over. Muslims completely lose the land. And when I say there's an expulsion, actually we'll get to that next. But anyway, these are some of the most amazing places. They're preserved, but they're ruins. Most masajid in Spain, if you go there, they're like nightclubs and bars. Like ruins of them are nightclubs and bars. Only the big ones were kind of maintained. And now we have to ask the question, why the fall? They focused on buildings and art and not on a military. Three converging powers from the north come in and will take Cordoba, Seville, and Valencia all at the same time. Granada is all that remains, and it's because they recognize the Christian power. They have like a relationship with the Christian ruler who's there. That's why it doesn't fall right away, but eventually it does as well. And Muslim rulers keep fighting each other, unfortunately. Even the last place that stands is there'll be two. It's just very representative. In Granada, they have two sultans in the same city. And they have many problems, and one of them asks help from the Christians to take over the other. And when he does that, eventually the Christians are like, well, we'll take over your kingdom too. Yeah. And he has to hand it over to the Granada, and there's an agreement for respective religion that was done by the last Nasirid Sultan, but Ferdinand II and Isabella don't honor it, they don't, and so that kind of takes place as well. It goes completely fallen. The last is just a complete decline, 1492 to 1609. It is actually said that Columbus, the day that he was asking Queen Isabella for supplies to go on this journey, they took it from the Cordoba Masjid. Everything to pay for it, they took it from Cordoba itself. Like, that's the day that Cordoba fell. It was literally as they were talking to him, the next thing that happened, they were distributing the wealth that existed within it. So what financed the Mayflower is actually the fall of Cordoba. So very, very sad on that. 1492, last Muslim Khalifa in the area, Granada falls. Aragorn and Isabella in their 1482 campaign. What ends up happening is there's forced conversion for Muslims and Jews. You are forced to convert. Thousands refuse and thousands are killed. I'll talk about how that ends up becoming millions in a second. Arabic is outlawed. Anyone who speaks it, punishment is death. Anyone who has an Arabic name that they go by, punishment is death. Even if you bathed like Muslims did, because Muslims set up a bunch of baths in places, weren't allowed to. At certain times, and this might be allegory, but if you bathed on Friday, that was punishable by imprisonment. You don't want to be like the Muslims, because Muslims used to bathe on Friday. It was a complete change. Arabic was, I already said that. 350,000 people who refused and were given some leniency were deported into North Africa. And by 1499, 3 million people were killed. And then they adopted this other thing called the purity of blood, which meant that if you were even Christian, but your parents were Muslim and converted, you had 1 year to 10 years to leave this place. And this would be also done, if you think this is only something that's done then, is I actually heard from, I won't say his name because I don't know if he wants his name shared, but Bosnian Muslim, who said that his mother, they were literally as the Albanian Bosnian genocides took place just a generation ago. It's not actually been that long, that when they were about to kind of throw them into these pits where they were going to be killed, she said, "No, I'm Christian, I'm Christian." They said, "It doesn't matter, what were your parents?" She escaped. But that took place even a generation ago. That was there, but it was a savage expulsion of Muslim culture, a complete rejection of it. And purity of blood is one of the model quote unquote genocides, which is a terrible thing to say. Took place at this time. The Catholic Church has since apologized for it. They used to have Ferdinand and Isabella actually sainted. They revoked their sainthood once they realized like how terrible and this was. That took place. But then, so that's what happens there. That's from 1492 to 1609, and then a second great expulsion takes place in 1609, in which they're all kicked out. All of their homes are completely destroyed. And ironically, this is where we're going to get into, it's much later on in our history, so we haven't reached this state yet. Remember, we're only at around 1100 when it comes to the rest of the Muslim world, but there's no help from Turkey or the rest of the Muslim world. It takes place at this time. And they moved to Tunis and other places in North Africa, and Muslim families still have their keys to their homes from Spain. It's a story very similar to Palestine in North Africa. You have many cities in which you'll have like ceremonial keys that are passed on. Of course, their homes have been many times destroyed over by then, but it's historically kind of put forward there. I had put the slide in just because this was supposed to be the agreement that Sultan of the Nasrids had for Queen Isabella and them as they're kind of negotiating. None of it was followed. It was supposed to be simple stuff like no muezzin should be interrupted by the act of calling prayer to prayer, and no Muslim molested either in performance of his daily devotions or observances of his fast or any other religious ceremony. But if a Christian should be found laughing at them, he should be punished for it. This is what he had adopted. Like, oh, your guys are going to respect religious tolerance and everything. Complete lie. Not only that happened, but the literal reverse of that actually took place. And keep in mind that they were expelled, but they kept their faith. There's something also beautiful about this. That you could make the argument that, oh, all that scholarship and everything failed. I would say it didn't fail. It was actually applied because there's a history of Muslims, this is going to be kind of interesting, becoming pirates to what? The little things that we can to maintain ourselves, maintain our identity, get back some of our property. So something interesting is Yusuf Reis al-Ta'iri. Yusuf Reis al-Ta'iri. What does that sound like? Is there a famous pirate that has something to do with this little bird? Jack Sparrow is based off of Yusuf Reis. You know the Pirates of the Caribbean? Yeah, Jack Sparrow, the character, is actually based off of them. There's this tradition of pirates that starts popping up across the Mediterranean, and because why? They're like, we've been kicked out of our homes where they can't, but the sea is unpredictable. Here we can get the upper hand and take advantage and do this. So that starts taking place. And it's so again that's there, and the ability of the state to be able to control these aspects of knowing who you are and using that against you starts with the Catholic Church and their baptism registries. So anyway, the Muslims, it's systematically kind of removed, and this registries start popping up of the purity of blood, who's actually there and who's not. And I get asked that question oftentimes, like, why don't Muslims have like registries of who's a Muslim and who's not? I'm like, oh no, the FBI has those. No, I'm kidding. But our actual answer is no. Religious traditions usually didn't do that. You know why those were developed? To make sure you weren't Muslim. That was really what it was for. That's why we'll register that you did a communion, you did this, you did this, you did this, so that we could track your Christianity. Track your Catholicism more specifically. And anyone who didn't, oh, they might be a secret Muslim. And then that's what we have in Europe. People want for Muslims to share in our values. This also idea of why Europe has such blatant quote-unquote Islamophobia. Part of it will be because there's a fear that it'll be conquered. It'll conquer once again. Because that's what happened before, is it completely took hold. So we have to make them assimilate. We can't have them continue to maintain their culture in some way. So yeah, that's there. What time is it? I could also go into Muslims in Sicily and Italy, but I might just do, I put one slide together just in a nutshell. Something very similar to what happened in Spain, I won't go through all the details, happens in Sicily, but it happens much quicker. And the major thing to remember about that will be, there is this guy, what is his name? Roger II. So just like what happened to Muslims in Spain, they come in, there's conquest, they take over, and then the Muslims kind of Islamicize or Arabize the Spaniards, but also it takes place the other way around. But the Muslims also get very kind of adopted into the culture there. The best representation of that is Roger II. His actual name is Al-Malik Roger Mu'tazil Billah, right? But look at even his name, Roger II. Just kind of an odd component of like who he is. He takes over the lifestyle of the Muslims he took over, so there's the whole thing. But by the time he's ruling, you'll have the actual Catholic Church come by and say that he's too Muslim in culture and everything, so they take over his. They say you will take over your kingdom. You can just go back to Jerusalem because you belong with the Muslims. And it's kind of put forward there. And why it's kind of interesting is when they kick him out, they also kick the rest of the Muslims out from the area as well. Saying like anyone who's influenced by Muslims, you need to all kind of leave. Why I put him as an example of this is anyone even associated with it. That's how much there was a kicking out of Muslim culture in totality. That a guy who was contemplating Muslim, should I be Muslim, should I not? He's even from the royal family. He's Roger. Like, no, you're too close to Muslims. Leave. Get out. Was it different in Spain? No, kind of. It just took place a lot kind of quicker there. But then there was also a massacre and others that take place in Sicily and in Italy as well. But anyway, this will be a conversation for it. Oh no, what just happened? Any questions as we kind of conclude Muslims in Spain? Yes. And Italy and Portugal.
So you're saying that like because of their lack of like military, that's why they were taken over. Who are they mainly getting taken over by? Like which European force is coming in?
In the beginning, it would have been the Franks took the Spaniards that used to live there took kind of refuge in France, what we would call France today. And then they start invading from the north as Catholicism starts being established after the Crusades. You can make the argument that they learned a lot from the Muslims in the Crusades, and they used it to kick out the Muslims in Spain.
So Which ethnic group is the dominant force in this? Is it the
The Spanish, but the French, let's see, the Spanish that took refuge in French lands when the Muslims had conquered.
and why were the Spanish taking refuge in French lands? I thought that they were all assimilated.
Not all of them, the royal families kind of ran off.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Because the other side of this is going to be Europe adopts this thing called the divine right of kings, which is that there's a marriage between political power and religious authority. Now, the biggest representatives of this would be like Henry VIII, not just the eighth, but the ones who came before, and also like Queen Isabella and Ferdinand. They're considered the leaders of the Catholic Church and movement at this time, because there's this conflation that starts happening that going from like empires that Europe used to have into nation states that have their own individual religious kind of tyranny. Yeah.
Why were they flourishing so much but they didn't have a good military? Like, why weren't you trying to have, like, you have all this, and you conquered Spain in the first place, why didn't you continue?
Why didn't you continue developing it?
Or,
This is where I'll say, people talk about the liberal arts a lot. Try raising a military with a bunch of liberal arts majors. Do you see how, like, this is the case study of that? Of like, oh cool, send all of you on into the humanities, good luck. You can't all go down that road. And there seems to be some element of that happening. And anytime they even needed to defend themselves, they would bring them up from a tougher part of the world, from North Africa. And when they did that, what happened next? Oh shoot, they took us over too. Like, seems to be, that's why I think Spain becomes a really good case study in terms of like, what happens when you go all in on the arts?
what was happening to the rest of Europe throughout Andalus as it was from the beginning until this end? What was happening to the rest of Europe?
The rest of Europe was developing because of, I would make the argument, what Andalus was giving them. Because they were sending their best and brightest into Muslim lands to study, and then they go back, and they're developing.
And they attacked.
They develop and then attack.
Were they like unified or were they like different?
What is it?
They unified under like Catholicism?
There were 3 different groups that attack, but they were much more united than the Muslims were.
I have a question.
Yes.
She made me forget my question. Hold on. Come back again.
A good parallel to this will be next time we'll be talking about Muslims in India, or we can go to Mongols. It's up to you guys. I'm going to suggest that we do Muslims in India. Muslims in Spain never end up being more than 40-ish% of the population, but now Muslims in Spain, they end up becoming 0% of the population with the expulsion. Muslims in India, interestingly enough, will be 10% of the population. You know what Muslims in India are today? 10% of the population. They stay consistent. Why? One of the arguments will be Muslims in India actually don't neglect their military. So they're actually going to be a surviving population that continues throughout. Even though they also have artistic accomplishments, not as many as Spain, but they will actually have staying power that's there. The other argument could be that Hindus, even though there's this weird situation that Muslims and Hindus, they have like this, there's this rap of it being totally antithetical to each other. The Hindus, there's some terrible atrocities that take place that Muslims do to certain times to like Hindu temples and things, and that Hindus do in terms of even today, like massacres of Muslims, but it's never as bad as what the Catholics do to the Muslims. So it's kind of interesting there. Yeah.
Kind of jumping off of that, I remember years ago you shared a story of Muslims in Spain where, like, if you could elaborate on it more, I think it falls under this exact period, like the expulsion, where like it's something like Muslims like praying standing up or something like that, where they always have to pray like behind a wall or something.
Yeah.
Do you know what I'm talking
Yeah, I do.
about? Okay. I pulled that out like from the deep core memories of my brain.
Spain has such an so when you go and visit like Alhambra, there are signs everywhere that say no one is allowed to pray here. Prayer is not allowed. It says everywhere because it's a museum, it's not a masjid. To the point where if you go there, you want to pray. This is a story that is kind of interesting. We were there, and you have this older, much bigger than me, Muslim man. I'm going to also say he's an older African American gentleman, and he decides he is going to pray. So the guard comes up and tells him, "You're not going to pray, right?" He's like, he doesn't say anything. He just kind of stays silent. No, I know, I get it. As soon as he gets to Alhambra, as soon as he faces the Qibla, Allahu Akbar, completely finishing his entire salah as they're trying to move it. He didn't care. Continued through anyway because he's in his 70s and he does not care. The tiny daisies of us that were there, if we tried that, we'd be in jail. That is good to know your age and your privilege in these places. But the point is, that's where one is kind of funny. No one can stop an old person from doing anything. Second is that's how much almost fear there is of like, if they come and they see and they start praying here, no, we don't want that. Like it's inbuilt that like Muslims are external. They weren't here. They were invaders. We don't want them to be intrinsically part of our culture or even return back to what they had here. It'll be nice museums. That's about it though.
No, I remember you saying something about like them praying like against the wall, where like praying against the wall because with their backs facing the wall, so it would not be a surprise if someone was to walk behind them, and that they'd always be in the field of vision of someone like walking in while praying. So even if they were mid-prayer, they would have a Bible or something like that.
Yeah. So the Muslims who tried to resist, that's the story you're talking about. You're talking about one that occurred in recent times. But the Muslims who tried to preserve themselves, they even adopted really weird fiqh practices, and we have books like this. That in fiqh, it started saying that you only can pray if there's a wall to your back. Why? Because if you got caught, the punishment might be death. So they started incorporating this into their practices, that you only pray with a wall behind you, so that one, you have peripheral vision, no one's behind you that they can walk into, so you have everything there. And then when you're praying, you should have a Bible with you, so that if someone did, you can just say, "Oh, I was praying, and why did I prostrate? Because Jesus prostrated." Like, that's kind of crazy. They started adopting that into their fiqh. Because why? That's how much persecution there was. That's not the only place that on earth that happened. That's why like when Muslims are discriminated against, I had the privilege of in my home in Chicago, my parents hosted in 2006, 2007, a couple of Muslims from Kazakhstan. And they remember in Soviet, like when the Soviet Union was trying to not have anyone be Muslim, every day they'd have to go and they would feed them a little piece of pork to make sure that they're not Muslim. They'd force them to drink water in case they were fasting or something. That was kind of done out of kindness to them, like to make sure that that's not the case. And it's like, how do they maintain their iman? The imam of that community said people would show up in my house and we didn't know how to pray, but we'd force everyone to throw up. So as I got there, because like we knew pork wasn't allowed, so we'd every day come home, that was their ritual. They'd force themselves all to throw up to try to get out if they could. Anything haram that they ate. And like we didn't know how to pray. So we just sit there and like one of us knew a little bit of Quran and that person would do it and everyone else would just listen. And that's how they preserved their iman for that long. And like he was crying as he was saying this, like I had no idea that Muslims could pray freely in non-Muslim lands. And he was like crying. It's like, of course, the situation was getting better in Kazakhstan, but he came to America to see like, Muslims in America have like, we were hearing that it's persecution here. And he sees us and is like, what are you talking about? Persecution? You get a weird look at an airport? That's what you're complaining about? Like, this is what we lived through. So yeah, subhanAllah, it's been through odd places when there's an effort to like destroy a way of life, it goes militant to destroy a way of life. So that's what that was. That's the idea of like the fear makes itself into the fiqh.
That story was in reference to this era of time in Spain, correct?
Yeah.
Okay, I remembered correctly.
Another thing that ends up happening at this time too, as things are falling, This happens in multiple times, but they would always in the morning do the prayer of the oppressed. And when they would do the prayer of the oppressed, they would incorporate within it any news of family members who got ousted or anything like that in the prayer itself. So dua nasiri becomes a significant portion of the Muslim tradition.
Because of this time period.
Yeah, because of the persecution. It's estimated close to 3 to 5 million Muslims were killed over the course of this 150 years. Yes?
In the slides, you said that thousands were killed, and then you, in parentheses, you said millions actually. What's the difference?
The official numbers are thousands, but it doesn't include those that were forced out of their homes. Those are just the ones who were executed. When you're forced out of your homes and told to just like go out to the sea, the numbers are much higher. It's kind of like in Gaza, the death toll is 70,000. Is the death toll 70,000? No, probably closer to 700, 800,000, unfortunately. So, kind of like that. Muslims went through dark times. That's one of the reasons we study history, to understand that was the case. And we didn't just receive this deen out of nowhere. Lots of people suffered through it. But it persevered. Some of the most amazing scholars of our that we read about today, or the knowledge that we build on, came through these type of persecutions as well. That's something for us to kind of appreciate and understand. And we'll go through that inshallah next time when we talk about Muslims in India. And then we'll jump over after Thanksgiving break into conversations about the Mongols and what happens to the rest of the Muslim world there. Sorry I kept you guys a little bit longer than normal. Jazakallah khairan. May Allah make us amongst those who appreciate our history, who appreciate the contributions of those that came before us, so that we may be amongst those who add to this amazing ummah that we are a part of, and may we not fall into the same traps that led to some of them their downfall, and we're able to achieve some of that success and more in our current times as well. Ameen. Jazakallah khairan. Assalamu alaikum.